Art Basel in 2020 is not taking place in Switzerland. It is taking place online for all the galleries around the world, including us. And we have a very beautiful presentation on the Art Basel website, which I hope you've all perused and enjoyed. But I guess the reason for you being here is that we are presenting a version of our booth, that online booth, in our gallery space in London. And for those of you who'd like to join me on this tour, where I'll be taking you through some of those highlights, I will take it away. For those of you not familiar with Ely House for Gallery de Deus Ropac in London, we've been here for some 5 years, and it's an incredibly beautiful, august 18th century building that stretches from Dover Street in Mayfair to Berkeley Street. It used to be the residence of the Bishop of Ely, hence the name. And we are happily ensconced in here and run a program of exhibitions that normally, that would normally be running now, but in these extraordinary circumstances, we thought for all of you, it might be quite nice to have a version of Art Basel for you to see. So we begin down this promenade with a 15-part work by the great man of American minimalism, Judd. This is a 15-part aquatint work that he made in the late 70s. And it's interesting just to take works on paper rather than the objects for which he's best known. Two-dimensional work was really an important part of his practice since the early 50s, in fact, when he began life as an artist and as a painter. And he almost surprised himself by not wanting to give up. I mean, he changed radically from his early beginnings as a painter, where he was an abstract expressionist or affected to be, and realized that actually what he was interested in was not gestural abstraction or expressing his inner demons on canvas. And he wrote a very famous signal text in the 60s called Specific Objects that set out his position and operated more or less as a manifesto for the sorts of strategies he wanted to engage in as an artist from that moment forth. But printmaking was a corollary of his work in 3 dimensions, and was almost a sort of passion project for him. He loved the process, he loved the idea of treating the paper and the idea as a sort of melting pot for his ideas. And this is a particularly good example of what was an abiding obsession with him, the ideas of repetition and difference, seriality, primary forms that are subtly altered across a number of works. And in this case, the motif remains the same. It's this parallelogram, and you simply have straight lines. Judd, in fact, abandoned entirely curved lines in about 64. He just thought they were superfluous to purpose. So straight lines is what you got. And in this case, you have these very austere vertical and diagonal lines that change just subtly according to the work that you're looking at. For those of you who've been onto our, sorry, I'll just change the screen. For those of you who've been onto our viewing room on the Art Basel website, you'll see a different wood print by Judd. It's a work from '92, which is a 20-part woodcut, and it's colourful. It's similarly vertical and horizontal lines, but explosively colourful and beautiful for it. I'm now entering our Berkeley gallery, and I'll just do a swing through some of the works that we're seeing here. And I guess it's worth saying to you that the purpose of this tour is to give you a good survey of the works that we have in our gallery, and hope that that kind of immediacy of seeing them live, so to speak, albeit virtually, comes across. And I'm going to pinpoint several of these to talk in further detail about. Any that you'd like me to talk about, please do say. And there are some works that are going to be on our Art Basel viewing room website that will be added this afternoon that you won't have seen either in the gallery or or in the viewing room thus far. Please, I'd encourage you to go and look at those later this afternoon. I believe they're going to include new works by David Sally, by Lee Bull, by Jules de Balancourt, and others. So please enjoy that. I thought it was worth beginning with the sculpture that I hope you can see clearly enough in front of you, which is a work from 2009 by Antony Gormley. It's called Quantum Void 5. And it's made in steel, this 3mm stainless steel. Each of these sort of spokes that come out of the central form are 3mm steel. And as with all of his work, or at least very large percentage of it, the form that the sculpture is determined by, articulated around, is his own. The void that you may be able to, I hope, be able to work out that's in the center of this mass is Gormley's form himself. It's the form is represented in absence, though. It's the void of the title, Quantum Void 5, is his own voided body. And it's a kind of powerfully, existentially resonant suggestiveness of the way that we move through the world, where the body that contains us is surrounded by all these dynamic vectors and spokes that speak of an aura that lies outside of our body. And I suppose it seems even more timely in this moment of social distancing and isolation, where the space that we act upon is somehow bigger than the body that contains us. And all his work is so connected to his interest in philosophy, in history, in science, in maths, but also in just a deep-rooted sense of humanness. There's a humanity to the work and a commonness, and or at least a desire to speak of that commonality between us that I think is particularly striking in this piece. The other sculpture in this room is by a female artist from a different era. She's Rosemarie Castoro, whose estate we represent. And it's a sort of nice segue. We walked past the Donald Judd works first, and Donald Judd has a very beautiful and famous studio in Spring Street in New York that's still available to visit. Rosemarie Castoro in the 60s was likewise housed on Spring Street in New York, and she was then partner with Carl Andre, the famous minimalist, and she really developed a coterie of incredibly dynamic intellectuals and artists who would gravitate towards her and Andre's studio and discuss what they felt was the most important intellectual and creative ideas of the day. And at that moment, she, I guess, identified herself pretty much as a minimalist. And yet this work from 76, some years later, clearly retains some of those interests. You can see these are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 spidery fingered lashes, enlarged human lashes that are serial, they're sequential, they're to some extent they relate one to the other, just as the Donald Judd print did, and yet they have a kind of wonkiness and a misshapenness that the serialists would have rejected. She was, or at least the development of her career was interesting because she began to be much more interested in a kind of personal expression and a desire to relate some of her understanding of her body and her identity as a woman and of her experience of living in New York into her sculpture. So it's a very, to me, very beautifully judged sculpture about the way we operate and move through space. It's worth just also pointing out, she had many strings to her bow, Rosemarie Castoro, and one of them was her interest in dance. And you get that slightly performative suggestiveness with this work that I think striking. And then on to some painting. We have three very significant German post-war artists in this room. Baselitz, which was just moved past, Sigmar Polke, and Anselm Kiefer. And because I'm looking at it, let's start with the Kiefer, which is a new work that you won't see on the viewing room in the Art Basel site, but will be or represents the precursor to works that you'll see in our Salzburg show later in the summer. This is a hugely rich, dynamic, storied painting filled with enormous incrustations of paint for one, and wooden metal elements that just so materially very rich. But the story of the painting is rather nice, and I might just say a word on it now. This is a painting, and the series of paintings that you'll see in Salzburg is similar, that is inspired by the 13th century German lyric poet called Walter von der Vogelweide. He wrote a poem called Broken Flowers and Grass about a tryst between a courtly nobleman and his maid. And the tryst was of course illicit, and would have put them both into very hot water had it been discovered. So they would secretly meet in the middle of the field and indeed crush, their bodies would crush the grass and flowers surrounding them. And the poem simply describes the impression that those bodies made on the flora and fauna. And the final line is describes a bird who witnessed the meeting and will never say a word. And Kiefer rather beautifully, romantically, plangently takes that idea of a meeting that's represented in absence and suggests it himself in paint with the sense of almost a burnt out fire with these streaks of flattened grass and these very knobbly bits of what must be flowers. I mean, it's so much more brightly colored than I think you'll see on the initial JPEG, but please do go in closely because the palette is so rich and beautiful. And it's worth, so that the painting is in many ways fundamentally romantic, as is the poem, but the addition that Kiefer makes is the motif of this scythe that runs from top to bottom, and of course has macabre connotations, both internationally, but specifically for Kiefer and his interest in his excavation of German history. So I hope that double sense of the romance and the kind of plaintive, tragic sense is conveyed. I'm now going to take you to these two artists were peers for a long time. Polke's no longer alive, but this is it's not a painting, but it's a photograph from 1975 from his travels in Afghanistan. Polke was a mercurial and unpredictable and kind of unboxable, ungovernable certainly, artist whose work encompassed so many mediums, but in photography it's almost as though he's not interested in, or at least he's so experimental that what he's interested in more is not the photography as a technical construct. He's interested in pushing it beyond its limits as a technical construct. So he treats it in the darkroom. He treats the darkroom almost as like an alchemical matrix where all sorts of jiggery pokery is going on, and he turns it almost into a painting. He treats the photograph like his canvas, and this is a unique and very, very rare print. New paintings by Baselitz continue to astound me for many reasons. Their size, their grandiosity, their elegiac nature. This is a painting of his wife Elke. It's called Elke in Frankreich. And two things strike me about it. One is the the sense of intimacy and tenderness with which he's depicted his wife Elke in pink, with these very subtle moments of sort of blush or rose that I hope you get a sense of here. And it's the second thing that strikes me about this painting is the the sheer bravura experimentality of an artist in his, well, certainly not in the first flush of youth, let's say. And he is painting this in a twofold process. He makes a large painting this size, and while that painting, which is fully articulated, is still wet, he lays on top a primed canvas that's bare, apart from the primer, on top of the wet paint on the canvas on the floor. He then presses in certain areas and then removes that top layer of canvas, and it creates the most incredible, so the canvas layer that's removed then becomes the painting. And it creates gestures and marks that you simply wouldn't be able to create using a brush. And I find that such an extraordinarily brave and just a remarkably interesting thing for an artist of his pedigree to be experimenting with at this age. So I hope some of that comes through over this phone call. We then go past an interesting Guston work from 1964. This is a period in Guston's life when he's between the abstract impressionism for which he made his name and the figuration, the Ku Klux Klan figures and the hooded works and the smoking characters in the studio that would come in later from 68. This 64, where he's totally in a tussle with himself about what he wants to do as an artist and where he wants to go. He's beginning to reject abstraction. You can just begin to see these motifs and forms emerging on the canvas that are, I suppose they look to me like 4 years before the hoods and the clan figures came out, they look to me like emergent masks or personages. Flanking the Guston is this grand painting by Emilio Vedova, perhaps the most, or one of certainly the most important post-war Italian artists. And he similarly had his own struggle with figuration, abstraction, and in the end decided entirely on the side of abstraction, almost to the extent of purging himself of anything that might resemble a representative detail. And his works, as you can, I hope, tell, are just painted in a flurry of furious energy. There's a huge dynamic power to the way these things are, the way the color and the paint is applied to the canvas. It's almost a vocabulary of expressive gesture. There's a performative element to it that I hope comes across. This is a painting by Ming showing Napoleon crowning himself. It's based on a Jacques-Louis David painting from 1804 that was given to Napoleon, or rather Napoleon had commissioned it. And the painting in the Louvre, the original, is 10 meters long and shows huge crowds of people coming to watch the ceremony at which Josephine is being, well, the pair of them, Josephine and Napoleon, are being having their coronation. But in this interesting version of that, Ming paints Napoleon surrounded by no one but the cardinal behind him, and crowning himself rather grandly, rather pompously, and rather magnificently. So I hope that sense of the kind of pomp and power of the man is conveyed. This is an exceptionally beautiful Robert Longo charcoal work from 2019. It shows a jellyfish floating, swimming, drifting in the water. And this I really would encourage you just to see online, because you'll get very good images where you'll be able to get close up to the mark making that is so signature to him. And I'm just going to take you all upstairs, where we will see a second number of works in our library room, which is up these stairs. And at the end, I hope that all you are enjoying your versions of Basel. I don't know how easy you're finding the site to navigate, but ours is certainly populated by some beautiful things, which I hope you're enjoying. For anyone in London, please do come to see the exhibition that we've got here. And for those of you who might be in Paris, we have a very, very special Gormley show that closes today, and a Sylvie Fleury show likewise closes today. We have a show of Daniel Richter works, new paintings, that opened in Salzburg recently, and that is totally spectacular. So for those of you a little further east, go and visit that. Now, turning back to what we've got in this gallery, just going past a couple of Baselitz paintings from '93, the one on the left, 2019, this one here. This is a Not Vital lotus flower work that can be shown either on the floor like this, or leaning up against the wall. But I wanted to introduce you to this brand new painting by Rakib Shaw. It's a painting on paper, which is remarkable for many reasons, but kind of chiefly among them is the date that he's added to the work, Lockdown 2020. This is a work that he's made in the last 2 months that is inspired by this extraordinary time that we're all living through. And it says something about the way an artist might respond to this period of hibernation, rather than sort of closing down and returning to, I don't know, idle pleasures. This is an artist who dreams up mythical lands, fantastical beasts, harp-playing monsters, trapeze artists, cherry blossom. It's a dream painting that he's called "The Harp Still Sings of Eternal Spring in My Heart." And I find it heartening to know that an artist whose creativity just can't be stilled by isolation, lockdown, whatever it might be. It's a very uplifting work. And I'm just now going to take you back to me, hello, and walk us through into what we call our library. It no longer houses books, but it houses, in this moment, several beautiful works of art. The first two that you can see on our end wall there are paintings by Jason Martin on the left, the new work, and Emy Knoebel on the right. Some of you may have heard the interview earlier in the week between my distinguished colleague Julia Peyton-Jones and Jason Martin. And if you haven't, that's still available via our website and the Art Basel site, so please do listen in. And then I thought I'd just say something about this exceptionally confident, sensuous, unusual, misshapen, but gentle and delicate painting by Emy Knoebel. This is a new work by the 79-year-old artist, and in many ways it's a continuation of the practice that he's been chipping away at for 60 years. And yet it's so experimental and different. I find it's amazing that an artist can find, and similar to Judd in that sense of finding, has an incredibly fine and narrow focus, but in the restrictions with which he imposes upon himself, is able to then find new avenues and new means of saying things that are fresh and somehow exciting through those limits, through those restrictions he places upon himself. This is I guess I'd call it a blue painting, and this is certainly something that you should see better using the high-res images on the website. But This is a light blue painting that is, the blue simply works as the veil behind which are this incredibly pellucid, gentle network of other colors, of blues and pinks, yellows, oranges, ultramarines, that snake around this shaped aluminium support, like a, I guess it's like a sort of 21st century Monet water lily. Yeah, I particularly love it. And for those of you who are interested in that sort of thing, his peers are, he joined Beuys in '64. He was very close with Blinky Palermo and another chap called Emi Giza. And he's an absolutely undervalued German master, fantastic artist. So I hope you, if you don't know him, please do discover more. Similarly ingenious in terms of his medium is Tony Cragg, whose work here, Hollowhead, is a bronze. It's brand new, and like the Gormley downstairs and like the Knoebel we just seen, it almost speaks, the things that it has removed from itself speak resonantly about itself, if that doesn't sound like too much of a contradiction in terms. You can see in the hollow head of the title, and you can see there are various almost like pockets of this body that have been dug out, excavated, and it looks like it could have been dredged from the sea 2,000, or from, it could be a 2,500-year-old Greek sculpture that's been dredged from the sea, like a bronze Venus de Milo, or rather even a future project in the process of becoming like a sci-fi object of some description. Incredibly finely finished, and I hope that sense of the robustness and the delicacy is coming through over this phone. Irvin Verm, whose sculpture this is, will be in conversation with Julia Peyton-Jones later on next week, we hope. So they'll talk about this fine new piece by Irvin. But two last works, both by collage artists, I'd call them. On the left is a David Sally. This is a painting he's made recently, and it relates to the work he's been making for 35 years. It's a work that combines disparate elements, New Yorker cartoons on the left and right, and then these central figures of the cake of the flowers and the leaves. It combines disparate elements in a kind of personal juxtaposition that makes a new form out of kind of nonsense. I mean, on the left here, that you have these man and woman who are about to jump off land into sea. On the right, you have several people about to go through a doorway, and in the center, you have this gaudily colored arrangement of foodstuffs and flora. It's called Serenade, and I think my interpretation of it is that the serenade itself is represented by the colorful element in the middle, the thing that will die within a week type thing. And the moment of that serenade is being contemplated by the characters on the left and right, who perhaps, despite their anxious looks, or perhaps because of their anxious looks, are wondering which way to go, whether to accept the serenade as an offering of love or not. And finally, this is a word piece, a new sculpture, wall sculpture by Jack Pearson. A word piece that combines, as these always do, letters, three-dimensional letters, wooden, plastic, metal, things that he has picked up on his travels, flaneur style, and brought into conversation with each other in a kind of epigrammatic, concrete poem. And in this case, the poem's message, because yes, seems like a seems like an optimistic and hopeful message for us all in this moment. And I hope, for those of you who are still with me, that's given you a good impression of at least what we've been trying to do to give you a sense of Basel away from Basel. Please do visit our viewing room on the Art Basel website throughout the next 7 days. The works will be there and are for you to enjoy. And as I say, anyone who's in London this week or beyond until through July, come and look at these works. They are here for you to for you to see and enjoy. And I hope all of you have a very pleasant Saturday, and I will hopefully see you soon. All right, goodbye.